welcome to the Fairy Whispering Podcast. I'm your host, Claire Silvermond. With me today are Executive Creative Director Gregg Hale and actor Gretchen Lodge, and both have many film and TV credits to their names. They have come to talk with us about a new podcast called Black Velvet Fairies. And the project has a multi-award winning creative team from the Blair Witch Project and Lord of the Rings. And it's part of the Emerald Anvil universe, which they'll tell us about in a moment. The podcast is innovative, blurring the lines between fantasy, folklore, and real life. Welcome, Gregg and Gretchen. So lovely to have you here.
Yeah, thanks, Claire. Thanks for having us on.
Thank you. Yeah, so happy to be on.
Yeah, and I wanted to start with Gretchen, if you could just talk about your character and lead us in that way, and then we'll talk with Gregg about the creative idea behind this podcast and the project.
Yeah. So the story follows Lucy, and she's kind of going through this, I feel like this moment in her life where she kind of needs something to shake it up. And so she follows this thread of being contacted about paintings from her grandmother who just passed, who she didn't have a necessarily strong relationship with. There's a lot of familial things that are that I think a lot of people experience in kind of troubled and fractured families. So she doesn't necessarily have a close relationship with her, but she feels this urge to follow this thread and go find these paintings. And in doing so, she kind of catapults herself into this strange world where things start happening to her, where her life kind of changes, and people come into her life that change her life, and vice versa. And it really changes her life in such a huge way. And we follow a portion of it that hopefully leads into something, leads into us knowing more about where this journey takes her. I think, great, right?
I hope so. I hope so.
I hope so too.
Sounds wonderful. And listeners can see the actual paintings as well, can't they, online, and follow your story on social media.
Right. Yeah.
Twitter. Yeah. So, Gregg, I'd love to know the background to this story. How did it all start?
Yeah. Well, I mean, there's Black Velvet Fairies, specifically, which, like Gretchen just said, is a story of Lucy finding these or getting bequeathed these paintings of fairies and following that path into this world of people who have a connection to this fairy planet called Hada. Right, so that's the basic premise of the podcast. But the fairy world that we've created called Hada is the setting for a larger, like, multi-platform fantasy story world that we're calling Emerald Anvil. Right, so the Emerald Anvil story world is this big epic fantasy universe centered on this fairy planet called Hada. And Hada is definitely more Game of Thrones than it is Tinkerbell. It's a very complicated, can be a very dangerous place because the Hadin, which is what they call themselves, they don't call themselves fairies in this story world. The Hadin are basically just like humans in terms of their capacity for good or evil. So some of the Hadin, some of the fairies that we're interacting with in these stories of Emerald Anvil are good, decent people, fairies, Hadin, and some of them are incredibly evil, just like humans, right? Black Velvet Fairies, the podcast, is just one of 4 stories that we're telling in this world. Black Velvet Fairies is kind of the earthly side of the story, where
Okay.
through Lucy's POV, we're learning about humans' perception of this other world. And
Mm-hmm.
what Lucy learns is that humans have been interacting with this world for thousands of years, and that humans have actually been transported to this world, and there's been generations of humans that have grown up on this fairy planet called Hada. So that's
Yeah.
kind of an earthly backstory. The novel is like a young adult fantasy novel about two kids that get teleported to that planet uh, in the first book called Journey to Hada. And without giving any spoilers away, I will say that there is a direct intersection between what Gretchen's character Lucy does in the podcast and what happens to the kids in the novel. They literally cross paths at some point. So those stories are absolutely connected. Then we are doing a board game called Glim, which is this beautifully illustrated um, board game, dice-based board game that we're saying is actually an artifact from this fairy world. That this is a game that the fairies played, that the Hadin played, that humans learned about and brought back to Earth. So we're presenting it as if it's this artifact from Hada itself. And then we're doing an interactive NFT activation called Battle for Hada. So four stories, standalone, so you can listen to the podcast and
Mm-hmm.
follow Lucy's story and be okay with just following that story. But it is interconnected with this other stuff. And that's the big picture, long-winded version of the story.
Yeah, and that's what I love about the whole concept, that it overlaps, rather like, well, just as the fairy world or the other world overlaps into our world sometimes, that you've got all of these different overlaps into, as you say, into the book. You've got experts that come on as well
Right.
and advise Lucy along the way. Um, I was just wondering, this, because this idea of overlapping worlds was used in the Blair Witch Project, wasn't it? So I was just wondering, Gregg, where that inspiration came from.
Uh, the true inspiration for Emerald Anvil, for all of
Mm.
it, was my oldest kid, Cupid, who's now 18.
Yeah.
When they were 5 or 6 years old, they loved everything that had anything to do with fairies. And being a nerd dad, I invented a little fairy character called Shara Leela, the herald fairy to the queen, and started writing letters to Cupid that I would leave for them around the house or in the yard or whatever. And we kind of got more and more elaborate with it. I buried stuff in the backyard for them to find. I made puzzles for them. And it was really about just exploring this fairy mythos with my kid. But I started thinking, like, what would be a fairy mythology, a fairy mythos uh, that I would enjoy as a fantasy, as an adult fan of fantasy stuff. Because look, I like the Tinkerbell movies, and I understand that that is not the end all be all of fairy stuff, which Gretchen knows a lot more about than I do. But like for me, with a 6-year-old kid, I was looking at it through the lens of Tinkerbell, which is fine, but I was looking for something with a little more substance. And what I liked, because of me interacting with my kid in this
Mm.
kind of physical way in our world, I really started with an idea of what would be what would be a fairy-based mythology that really felt rooted in the physical world, right?
Mm-hmm.
uh, and not just through fairy circles or whatever, and just the general idea of there being some sort of fey magic that teleports you or takes you to another world that maybe you never come back from. But trying to explain that mythology, I wanted to be true to our understanding of what a fairy is, but come up with a reason on the other side, meaning in the fairy world on Hada, that's like a little more sci-fi, like a little more science
Yeah.
fiction. Like you could explain it almost scientifically. And that's a
Mhm.
little bit of what we did with Blair Witch, right? Which was like, yeah, ultimately the witch is a supernatural being and there are kind of unexplainable supernatural things happening, but the connection to that world was very physical in terms of kids go into the woods and disappear, and then there's evidence and there's all sorts of stuff that you can look at in our world that
Mm.
connects you to the supernatural world of the witch. And I mean, and actually it's very astute of you to mention that, because like I haven't even thought about it conceptually that way, but that's really what we're doing here too, right? Is you have this supernatural to us, to the Hadin, it's not supernatural at all, but to us, Hada is supernatural.
Mhm.
And Gretchen's story, Lucy's story in Black Velvet Fairies, is exploring that tangible connection. Lucy starts this journey with these paintings that she's literally looking at and knows that there's some sort of connection. She feels it in her bones that there is some sort of connection to something else, right? So that's what
Yeah.
Lucy starts exploring.
And thanks for explaining that, Greg. And what I love about Lucy's character, Gretchen, is that she's kind of quite skeptical at the moment, even though she's described as a geek, or I've forgotten a bit of a geek, isn't she? But she seems quite sort of resistant at the moment to the whole idea of this mystery and fairies. But I'm just wondering what your experience and interest in fairies is, Gretchen, because I see that you've had a lifelong interest in them.
Yeah, I definitely have. It was so
Mm.
exciting and so amazing to be able to talk to actual experts and have these conversations with them when we were recording the podcast. Um, it was just all of the information that they brought was so interesting. And of course, like for me as a character, it was like really easy to respond to it because I was so intrigued, with everything that they were saying and all the information that we were getting, not only as the characters, but also that we were digesting as, actors, the actor who played James as well, because he did a lot of the interviews with me. And my personal, I guess, interest with them. I grew up in, I've always been an artist and a creator and a painter. And so had a lot of interest in kind of like old Victorian art, old,
Yeah.
like where kind of like the art history of where some of, I grew up painting a lot of florals and a lot of, botanicals. And so I think I was kind of following that thread of where kind of those paintings came from. And so I had a huge interest in Victorian art, and then of course stumbled upon like Cottingley fairies. And I mean, as a kid growing up in, I grew up in Idaho, so it's like, just woods and trees. And I had a lot of opportunity to explore as a kid. And I was like, please, like, come find me. You know what I mean? I always wanted an interaction. I always wanted something, and I think that's natural for any kid to kind of, your imagination is running wild. I wasn't, I didn't have like a phone to go to kind of like numb my senses. I was like truly just exploring my imagination and kind of, creating. And, I think that's where that interest came from, because I was, really truly engrossed in nature and feeling this sort of sense or presence that something else could, or I hoped would be there with me. And so the Cottingley fairies was like my initial, kind of
Really? Yeah.
introduction to
Mm.
it. And I was like, oh, so jealous. Like, I was like, oh, these girls. I was like, and Gregg, I think it's amazing that you did that for your kid. I didn't have anyone doing that, like leaving little clues or things for me. So I just kind of had to create this, world of my own and hope that little gifts and offerings and things that I was leaving for these things that I hoped were there playing in the woods with me, were being received. And so, yeah, it was very interesting talking to these experts and talking to people who really are so engrossed and so knowledgeable about fairy lore, like yourself, because I think there's so many aspects to it, and there is truly a sense of, if you approach it with kind of respect and you approach it with kind of wanting to understand more about this world, then you may in fact have an otherworldly encounter or something that that visits you. And I just love this. I love the idea that an encounter like that could be, because you've opened yourself up to that world, and it also could propel you into something magical, not like another magical world, but it could propel you into a series of events in your life that otherwise wouldn't have happened, which Lucy does experience. She's skeptical, and because I think she's experiencing things in real time, and she's experiencing things in real life. And so, of course, I like to think if something like that happened to me, that I would be brave and courageous and like, yeah, let's do this. Yes, but I think you just never know. I'm interested to hear about your encounter, if we have time, because I think for Lucy, it's like she wants to believe, she wants to be there for it, and really experience these otherworldly things that are happening to her, but they are actually happening to her. So she's, understandably a little scared. Like, how far do I dip my toe into this? What's going to happen if I do? Where is this going to take me? The idea of having, your life, as comfortable or as uncomfortable as it is, rearranged because you're saying yes to something that's like, is really, it's really frightening, because you're like, I don't know where this is going to take me. I don't know what's going to happen next. I don't know if this is going to, how this is going to change my life. And am I ready to say yes to all those things or be open to all those things?
And I think part of, like, from Lucy's perspective as as the character Lucy, part of her, and look, Gretchen so embodies Lucy that it's kind of hard for me to separate Gretchen and Lucy to some degree. And so I would really totally defer to what Gretchen thinks is happening for Lucy. But when when I was part of the writing process with me and Jamie Nash, who was the actual writer who put everything down on paper, based on the starting idea that I came up with. What I always felt about Lucy's relationship with her grandmother is that when Lucy was about 6, which is about the age of my kid, um, she was her grandmother wasn't pretending to have a relationship with fairies. Her grandmother really did. And Lucy just accepted that as a 6-year-old, that, yeah, I go to grandma's house and I go out in the woods and kind of strange magical things happen. And grandma just explains it as it's the fairies, or it's the woods, or it's the spirits of the woods. And so now as an adult, Lucy is remembering believing that, right? So part of it in the very first episode, I love that at the end of the first episode, no spoilers, after she finds the paintings, where all her defenses drop at the very end, right? She, like you were saying, Claire, like, she's very, very cynical and very, like, arm's length with all this, but she's still doing it. And then by the end of the episode, when she has the paintings and she's kind of had this weird experience, again, no spoilers, she's kind of had this weird experience, those defenses drop for a second, and she really kind of has not a breakdown really, but an emotional release, because I think that's that's kind of that gate dropping and
Yeah.
Lucy saying, okay, I'm going to reconnect with this thing that I once knew. I really knew this as a kid, and now I've got to get back to that childish one,
Mm.
that childish ability to be open to that kind of thing.
Yeah, and childhood, is such a portal to that world, isn't it?
Yeah.
Because I know it's similar to what you were saying, Greg, with my children growing up. That helped me reconnect with that world as well. My creativity, imagination, and we go out on adventures. I mean, they're teenagers now, so they
Yeah.
don't go out so much, but
Yeah.
when they were younger, it was wonderful. We created this this world between us. And but also as part of that, had some interesting experiences as well that I can't explain. So it's almost like you were saying, Gretchen, once you open yourself up to this world, then it's like, aha, that person wants to interact with us,
Mhm.
and it's like attracting like or something. I'm not sure how it all works, but it seems to be the way. Or there are people that have experiences that are completely skeptical about anything paranormal, and then have a fairy experience from nowhere that completely changes their whole life and their perception of what reality is. Which I think those are my favorite ones, actually, when somebody experiences something that they're not totally not expecting. Yeah.
I
So,
think it's amazing too. Sorry, I think it's
yeah.
amazing too to be able to like foster that kind of imagination and that kind of openness to those encounters in a child. Because like you're saying, it's like that it really is, that really is the time when you are kind of like most open to those encounters. And so if you have someone who's like an adult in your life who's encouraging that, or like this isn't like outlandish, like you can actually have an encounter or an experience, or like this is a possibility to experience this other world. I also think that that's really important for a lot of reasons.
Yeah, definitely, especially with in this day and age, like you're saying, with smartphones and children from a young age being encouraged by some parents to look at screens from when they're old enough to sit in a buggy. So
Mhm.
it's so important to have that connection with the imagination, that connection with possibilities of something that's beyond our realm that we can create with, use our
Mhm.
natural abilities to create and connect with something that's meaningful as well. Yeah.
Yeah.
So I wanted to, I was going to just talk about, I mean, would you like me to share an experience, or you've
Yeah,
got 5 at
absolutely.
the
I
end?
would love that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
So because I've been writing about this, so I was thinking actually the first experience I had that I feel was fairy was when I was about 19, and I was staying at a friend of my dad's in an old cottage in Somerset, and I was sharing a room with my sister. And it's a very old cottage, the 1500s, that sort of era,
Wow.
and it's just surrounded by fields, no street lighting or anything. So I was trying to get to sleep. My sister had already gone to sleep. It was pitch black in our room. And at the end of the bed, I could see a little green light that was about that couple of inches high. I couldn't work out where it was coming from because there wasn't any street lights. There were no lights on in the house. It was obviously time, it was the 1990s, so it's before mobile phones and anything electronic that would create that sort of green light. And I just lay in bed staring at it, trying to work it out. And it didn't feel threatening, but because I couldn't work out what it was in my mind, I just pulled the duvet over my head and tried to get to sleep because it just, it's beyond my understanding of what it could be. And then the next day, I searched the whole room. I made sure there wasn't any lights coming from anywhere. I could find anything. So it's only in retrospect, looking back now from hearing other people's experiences of fairies and also UFOs. People have seen UFOs in their rooms that are like lights, that I thought this has got to have been something to do with the land, to do with fairies.
Mm-hmm.
That's my feeling. So that was my first experience. And then after that at university, I had an experience which involved taking substances, um, partying as a student. And I went home, I felt really dreadful, and I was I'd gone to sleep and I'd woken up to get some water, and I was sleeping on a mattress on the ground, on the floor, in my room. There was street light outside, so it wasn't completely pitch black in my room. And I had a fig plant beside the bed, call them rubber plants as well. They've got big, shiny leaves. And I just glanced over this way, and at the corner of my eye, I saw a little person sat in the plant.
Oh, wow.
And it was just very brief. And my immediate feeling was that it was an elf. That's what came to me. And I couldn't, because it was dark, I couldn't work out colours, but I had a feeling that it was wearing earthy colours. It had dark skin, dark eyes. And it was just a brief few seconds sighting. Since then, writing about the experience, as I have been in the last week, I thought, why did I think it was an elf? And so I researched elves in Wales because I went to university in Wales. And there's a type of elf, I've forgotten the name, I haven't got it written down in front of me, but there is a type of elf, like fairy, that lives in that part of Wales in the valleys. And they hide in dark places. So, it was dark. But everything I was reading, I was like, oh my gosh, I can't believe I haven't researched this before.
Yeah.
This experience. And now all these things it's saying about these beings, it's like really resonating with me.
Oh my
So
gosh.
yeah.
Well, I love when you mentioned the UFOs.
Mm.
I loved one of my favorite parts of the podcast is Greg Newkirk was a paranormal researcher that we had as a guest, and I think you've heard that
Mm.
episode, Claire. Where Greg is a very serious paranormal researcher that
Yeah.
actually comes at things with a lot of skepticism. He's
Mm.
really trying to look at it as like, I don't know what this is, but it's something, and let's figure it out. Which I love his approach. I thought he was a great guest, but I loved what he was saying about the crossover between, what might feel like a an extraterrestrial experience, like an
Yeah.
alien being in your
Mm.
room, or a ghost being in your room or a fairy being in your room
Mm,
could all be the same thing, right? And
mm,
I just thought that was such an interesting thing because, like you were talking about with your experience, that is this kind of like universal seeming experience that a lot of people have, right?
yeah.
So you can't just discount it, right? You have to, there has to be some explanation for it. And I loved that, that it could be fairies. I mean, why not? Why couldn't it be fairies? I really like that part of the of that episode.
Yeah, yeah, and I'm interested in how we interpret it as well.
Yeah.
So why did I immediately recognize it as that,
Mhm.
as fairy, and not as an ET or a
Because
ghost?
you had the
Yeah.
same, did you have the same feeling that it was something fey when you saw the green light in the cottage as well? Or was
I
that
didn't
just
I didn't know what it was. I just couldn't work it out. And it's only retrospectively what I know about fairies and the land and the fact that it was surrounded by farmland. And I thought could have been nature spirit. So that's my feeling that it was something connected with that land rather than a ghost or
Hmm.
um, an alien or something.
I think we also talk a lot about um, not only why the encounter happens, but then how it changes you in like moving forward. And
Yeah.
do you have a feeling that it was for a specific reason at that time in your life, or that it changed you moving forward?
The one at university or the,
Hmm.
yeah, it did because the interesting thing was that I was focusing on the landscape for my art degree that I was doing. I was focusing on my connection with the landscape. And I was going out and taking photos of me with friends in the land and paintings. And so I was really, and I only put two and two together afterwards, really,
Hmm.
looking back. Oh, yeah, well, I was really focusing on connecting with the land.
Yeah.
And so that would make sense that something from the land would connect with me. And when I
yeah.
went home from university, I just started drawing fairies. And I hadn't drawn them on my course, and it's something that I hadn't drawn since a child. And but these fairies that I was drawing weren't like a typical Tinkerbell type of fairies. They were more just very unusual looking. And it was only after that, and I hadn't seen Brian Froud's work at that stage. It's only after that that a friend of mine said, "Oh, have you seen Brian Froud's fairy artwork?" And I thought, yes, that's the kind of fairy that I relate to.
Oh
Right.
wow.
Something that's very connected to the landscape. And, if you look at a tree, then you see it emerging from the tree or from the rocks.
Yeah.
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 Yeah, I love his work. Do you know, I don't know, I've loved, gnomes and fairies, basically anything that he did when I was a kid. But do you know, does he come from a place of like, does he say that he has experiences or had experiences that he's,
Yeah.
oh,
Yeah.
okay.
I went to see him because he lives up in Chagford, which is only about 20 miles from me.
Oh, okay.
I live in Devon. And he did a talk in Chagford at the church last June. And he was talking about some of his fairy experiences.
Oh, okay.
Okay.
Yeah.
I mean, that
Mm.
totally makes sense because there was always, especially when I was a kid, there was something about, and this is kind of like, what I'm attempting to do or what we're attempting to do with Emerald Anvil is like, there
Mm.
was something about his work that felt very rooted in reality. Like it felt like, oh yeah, that thing, even as outlandish as they might appear, it's like, oh yeah, that's connected to reality somehow. And not all fairy art is. Like a lot of fairy art to me
Mhm.
feels very detached from anything that feels earthly, but his stuff always felt like there was a connection between our physical existence and that being's physical existence, which I also loved with John Cruz. And did you know John
Mm.
Cruz, art expert? Did you, if
I
you know what?
know of him and his website, yes. And
Okay,
I've got his book on pixies because I'm writing about pixies.
yeah, I thought he was fantastic,
Yeah.
but
He's
I
amazing. Yeah.
yeah, he was
Mm.
amazing. And I what I loved about him was like kind of what you were saying, Claire, is like back when people were in nature all the time,
Mm.
especially in the British Isles, everybody believed in fairies because
Mm.
everybody was out there having that connection to the earth. And
Yeah.
as things became more industrialized and more urban, that attachment starts going away. And
Hmm.
it totally makes sense, right? That
Yeah.
they're nature beings, or they're somehow connected to the primal part of our planet, right? And the more we're detached from that, the more we're detached from them. I mean, totally makes sense
Yeah.
to me.
And in your story, in the Black Velvet Fairy story, are the fairies connected with, is part of their message to do with the world and the environment, or have they got another agenda?
They okay in Emerald Anvil, not just Black Velvet Fairies, but in the mythos that we've created um for the overall Emerald Anvil world, um the Hadin are not necessarily connected to us through nature.
Right.
Um Not earthly nature. They're actually connected to us through natural features of their world. On their world, there are things that to them are completely natural, to us are completely supernatural, but they have portals built into their world that took them thousands of years as beings to learn how to use. And not only learn how to use, but learn how to use the energy on their planet to fly, right? So
Mm.
everything about them is a learned behavior. They're not born with wings. They
Mm.
manipulate the energy on their planet to make things that look like wings to us. And then they have these portals that are a natural part of their world that took them thousands and thousands of years to learn how to operate, that allows them to project an image of themselves to Earth and interact with humans that they want to interact with.
Mm.
So what humans are seeing, why we think of them as little, because on Hada, they're human sized,
Mhm.
or every shape and size that a human would be. They just have the ability to manifest these things. They call them glyphs, not wings. They can manifest these things that allow them to fly. So when they're projecting themselves to Earth to interact with a human, we're seeing basically a little holographic image of them floating in this portal, hovering in this portal, interacting with us. So that's why we have the perception of, oh, they're these tiny little magical beings, because
Yeah.
to us, everything about them is tiny and magical until they teleport you to Hada. And then when you're on
Yeah.
Hada, you're in this place. It's like, okay, this is to us this magical place, but to them, it's just their physical world. So their connection from like an environmental standpoint is more about the environment of Hada
Mm.
than it is about the environment of Earth, because at the crux, that the at the center of the story is basically humans are a part of every religion on Hada. So Hada is a planet, right? Hada, there's like 2 billion Hadin on Hada. It's a whole planet of them. It's not one little kingdom or one little realm. It's dozens and dozens of countries. They
Mhm.
call it dominions, right? And humans are a part of, so there's dozens of religions. They have religions too. And humans are a part of every religion for them, because they look at the natural world and like, whoever made this world that we're in made these portals to interact with these other beings called humans. So there has to be some religious reason, right? So for some of the Hadin, humans are the pathway to enlightenment, right? We have to interact with humans, but we have to bring humans to Hada because humans complete us. Our interaction with humans is what completes us as Hadin, right? We can't be total beings. We can't reach nirvana or heaven or whatever we call it without interacting with humans.
Mm.
On the other end of the spectrum, there are religions that humans are literally like demons. Like the portals were there, like the forbidden apple. The God put the portals there to tempt you, but you were never supposed to use them. And now that you've used them, you've brought demons to our world, and we have to get rid of them, right? So that's kind of the from a fantasy story world perspective, that's the big conflict in this world,
I
right? Because the
see.
the
Yeah.
kids get teleported to Hada.
Mm.
Really, the story, for the most part, is playing out on Hada. Lucy's story is playing out on Earth. I won't say, because even Gretchen doesn't know if Lucy makes it to Hada or not. Maybe she does, maybe she doesn't. Um, but but the kid's story plays out about a third of the way through the book, and this is not a spoiler. About a third of the way through the book, the kids get teleported to Hada, right? So the kid's story,
Okay.
brother and sister Morgan and Orion DeLeon, 14 and 11, their story plays out completely on Hada, and at the center of that story is this basically like a planet-wide holy war between the Hadin who think that humans are good and the Hadin that think humans are demons and need to be wiped out. That's kind of the, the super synopsized um, version of it. Um, so yeah, that was a very long-winded answer for your for your
Oh,
question.
it's really good to, it's interesting to hear that, how, yeah, how they see us, how some of them see us as
Yeah,
demons.
how some of
Yeah.
them see us. And and so part of what I'm doing, as a storyteller is, like I think really all science fiction and all fantasy to a lesser degree, but science fiction definitely, because there is some sci-fi elements to Emerald Anvil, is you're really just exploring human issues through a lens of some non-human mechanism, right? In this case, fairies or Hadin are really a way to explore what does make people into zealots. Like what does motivate people to kill and murder and maim in the name of religion, right?
Yeah.
Because I think that's something that we're dealing with in our everyday world. And I'm not really qualified to explore that in a real world sense, but I do feel I can explore that as a fantasy writer and create a world where you can look at religious views a little objectively and go, oh, that's kind of crazy that this person believes this Hadin believes this and that Hadin believes that. And maybe because it's fantasy, you could look at both of them and say, oh, that makes sense. Because look, in Hada, and this is something that Lucy does start to learn about. Uh, the interaction between Hada and Earth stopped almost completely about 150 years ago because a human
Yeah.
um, caused a horrendous thing called the reaving that
Mm.
destroyed about a third of the planet, made a third of the planet uninhabitable, or at least they think it's uninhabitable. So for the Hadin who believe that humans are bad, they've got a lot of evidence. They just point at one third of the planet being uninhabitable and say, well, a human did that. And a human did that because we allowed connection between Earth and Hada and we paid the price. So, so you can kind of look at it and go, oh yeah, they kind of have a point, so the
Mm.
kids, Morgan and Orion, are kind of there are eyes into that world, right? Like, why do they believe this? And why do these other Hadin want to do it? We'll go through hell to defend me and save my life because of their religious beliefs. And what does that mean to them? So, yeah, anyway, I diverged there a lot.
Yeah, it's interesting because people that see fairies quite often see them in pre-industrial revolution style clothing. So
Right.
medieval, or pre 1800 style clothing. So it's like that touches on that idea of once the Industrial Revolution started, then that's when we became more separated from the land. And it's almost like the fairies, with the way that they dress, it's a symbolic way of showing us that this is what you've left behind, this simpler way of life where clothing was made on a loom, or
Right. Yeah.
it's yeah.
Yeah. And
Mhm.
we actually get into that. There is a um one of the things that was really fun for me writing the novel. Lucy hasn't gotten into it that much yet, although there is some stuff later. You haven't gotten to it yet, Claire, but we get into some deeper mythology later that
Mm.
talks about some of these connections in the mid 1800s, right? That becomes like the focal point. Lucy figures out that 1850s to 1860s is kind of a focal point. Um, and that's something that we play with, is like when the kids go there, like all the Hadin are still in like some sort of mix of between uh, Victorian era clothing, and medieval clothing, depending on where they are. Different Hadin dress different ways. But that idea that that's cut off
Mm.
and their style, and then it makes you think, well, who was influencing who? Like, we're humans seeing the way these Hadin have always dressed, and we're just like, oh, let me adopt that, and then that became something that humans did.
Yeah.
Or the Hadin looking at humans and going, oh, I like the way that human looks. I'm gonna make my clothes look like like a Victorian era dress, or a Civil War for the United States, like a Civil War era, tunic that a man would wear. Um, was it the other way around, where the Hadin looking at humans and going, oh, I like those clothes, let me dress that way? And that's been kind of a fun part of the novel, because the kids show up, and like, the boy's wearing his pajamas, and Morgan, the girl, is like wearing, an Adventure Time t-shirt and tennis shoes, and everybody is like looking at them like, what in the hell is that?
Great. I love that. Sort of just being, yeah. It really interests me about this crossover between the extraterrestrials and the fairies. And have you read or heard of Jack Valley's Passport to Magonia? Either of you? Where,
um
where he looks at the whole ET phenomenon
did
and
Greg mention that book? Does Greg mention
Someone
that?
mentioned it. Yes, someone has
yeah,
mentioned it, but I haven't been able to get into it, but it's so interesting.
Yeah, I
yeah.
think Greg Newkirk mentions that in his interview, doesn't he?
Oh,
I
right.
do not know
Yeah.
that book, but I think that's the book that Greg references, right? That's about that crossover between,
Oh, you might have. Yeah. Yeah,
I
it's
think
well
it was,
known.
but I
Yeah.
don't know the book personally, no.
Mm. So, are you going to use any of the real life encounters that people have as a basis for these stories? Because you know that there's the fairy census that Simon Young has pulled together over the last, well, since 2014.
Oh wow.
Um, there's two censuses now, from 2014 to 2017 and 2017 to 2023, and it's worldwide experiences of people that have encountered fairies.
Oh wow. Yeah,
So,
I would love to do that. I mean, one of the things that is going to happen. Hopefully,
mm,
this isn't too much of a spoiler. But like I said, contact with Earth has been cut off almost
mm,
completely for about 150 years, but not completely, because Lucy realizes that something has been communicating with her entire life. She's just been
Yeah.
ignoring it, right? So
Yeah.
contact isn't completely cut off, right? And that's
yeah,
part of what Lucy's journey is like, there are still people who are connected. In fact, there are religions on Earth built around this connection with fairies, right? That's the thing that we're exploring on the earthly side. And I really do like the idea. The plan is that this is 9 novels. If
Mm.
we get lucky enough and we have some success, the main story of Morgan and Orion is going to be 9 novels is the plan.
Mhm.
I love the idea, and exactly how it would happen. Honestly, I don't know, but I do think that a rekindling of that connection is part of the story, right? So I love the idea. I'd love to have the opportunity of connecting what's happening in our fictional world of Hada to people's real world fairy experiences here.
Mm.
I would love nothing more than to do that.
Yeah, there's a really good book that you might be interested in Gretchen
Yeah.
called Seeing Fairies. Just
Oh yeah.
Oh, I love that.
yeah, Seeing Fairies. It's by Marjorie T. Johnson, and it's from the Lost Archives of the Fairy Investigation Society,
Oh,
Oh,
wow.
which you
that's a
can join. I'm a member. You
oh
just
wow.
email Simon Young,
I'll write
Oh
that
my
down.
God.
and he'll send you a certificate to say you're a
Oh,
Really?
member.
cool.
Oh my God, that's
Yeah,
amazing.
yeah, it's so
And
cool.
what did you say
Um,
the what's called, Claire?
it's called
The
Singing
society?
Fairies by Marjorie T. Johnson,
Uh-huh.
and it's the Lost Archives of the Fairy Investigation Society.
Oh my gosh, I gotta
So
look
it's
that
all
up.
modern sightings of fairies.
Oh my
Yeah, yeah.
God.
Fairy Investigation Society.
Yeah, fairy,
I'll look
yeah,
that up.
which Simon Young has restarted, and that's the censuses that he's pulled together since 2014 are
Oh,
part of
oh
that regeneration.
God.
Mm.
Oh, I love that. I definitely gotta look that up. That sounds
I'm
Yeah,
great.
definitely, yeah, I'm absolutely gonna look that up.
I just
I'm
love Fairy Investigation Society. It's like the best name
it's
ever.
brilliant.
It's incredible. Yeah. And I
Good.
love that you're a member. That's amazing.
I got a feeling that Gretchen's going to be a member about 5 minutes after.
I know. I'm like, wait a sec, guys.
It's like, I gotta get on that.
Yeah, exactly. Very excited. What is the Fair Investigation Society do? Like, do you meet up? Do you share stories? Do you share
Yeah.
information?
Well, Simon set up a private Facebook group. So once you've joined, you can be part of that. And it's just full of all of us researchers sharing information. So you can ask, anything about fairies or, something you're researching, and someone will say, oh, yeah, look at so and so.
Oh,
Or,
I love that. That's
Yeah,
yeah,
amazing.
it's,
yeah, and I really do love the idea of, right now I'm so laser focused on just because, the podcast just launched, the board game launches in a couple of weeks, the novels about a month after that, and then the NFT thing, we'll see sometime this summer. But I'm so laser focused on all that. I've just got those 4 iterations of the story in my head so firmly. But I definitely do have been thinking about, like, when do I want to make that reconnection. That's always been part of the story. I don't think that's too big of a spoiler. Um, so I should really get in on this and try to learn, like, what is contemporary thinking on fairies, right? Because I'm sure that
yeah.
thinking has evolved, over the years, and I would love to, like, get a better understanding for the way um people look at fairies in the modern world. I think would be great for me.
Yeah, yeah, it's fascinating because, people are still having experiences,
Yeah,
and it's interesting to look at how those experiences are affected by where we are now, whether some experiences have changed since 100 years ago, or whether some of them are the same. Yeah,
yeah, yeah. Well,
it's
there's a thing in the book that, like, um in the novel, Morgan's wound, right? Your characters always have to have a wound. Morgan's wound is when she was 4 years old, she saw her mother taken by fairies, like a
um,
fairy. teleported her mother away, and she never saw her mother again when she was 4.
Mm,
So now 14 in the novel, and for 10 years, her dad ends up in an asylum or a facility because of the incident with her mother. So she's raised by her grandparents, and
mm,
they spent 10 years and multiple psychologists and therapists convincing Morgan that what she saw was not real. So really Morgan's journey at the beginning of the book is reconnecting with this thing that she knew was true when she was 4 years old and has
mm.
been convinced now that it's not true. So in order for her to make that journey, right, it's like what Gretchen was saying about saying yes to something. She
Yes.
has to say, yes, that's really what I saw. That really
Mm,
happened. I really do believe that a fairy took my mother. She has to reconnect with that truth before she
mm.
can make her own journey, right? That's Morgan's experience in the first, third of the novel before she gets teleported there, is she has to come to terms with her own understanding of what happened to her.
Yeah. And yeah, that's very true of fairy sightings where people, especially where two people see the same thing, where there might be somebody that they see something together, but then one person will hold on to that experience and be like, oh my gosh, that was just amazing. And then perhaps the other person, the other witness, will just totally deny
Oh, wow.
what
Oh,
they've
that's super
seen,
interesting.
or, just gradually somehow perhaps forget it.
Yeah.
So the other person is like, do you remember? Do you remember us seeing that? And they'd be like, no,
Oh, wow.
remember that, So that seems to be a common
I feel like that's so interesting because it
theme.
it really is like whatever point you are in your own life and your own journey, are you ready for it? Are you ready for something that's going to change your perspective on something, or are you not? You know what I mean? And like our subconscious is so powerful, we can
Yeah.
truly just push
Yeah.
something away and be like, no, that doesn't exist. That doesn't, that didn't happen. That's not real, as opposed to someone who's like ready and open and ready for like wherever acknowledging that takes them,
Yeah. That's
Yes. Yeah.
that's super true. And because that's right, even that, because that's true of so many experiences, right? It doesn't have to be a supernatural fairy thing. You can have so many things happen in your life
Yeah,
where people have the same whatever inciting incident that makes one person change their life because they were ready
Mm.
to make that change, and another person maybe goes in the completely opposite direction. That's so true. Yeah,
totally.
Yeah.
that's super
Mm.
cool. That's super interesting.
Mm. Thank you for your time today
Yeah.
and speaking with me. Is there anything else that you'd like to share about
No, I
Black
mean,
Velvet
I feel like
Fairies?
you've introduced at least me, you've introduced me to more new stuff than I've introduced to you. I'm like super excited about getting into more of this uh world that's really looking at the serious connection between fairies and reality. So yeah,
Mm.
I'm excited to take what I've learned from you and go forward with that information.
I am
Oh,
too.
that's
I am
lovely.
too. I
Yeah, yeah,
think
sure.
like taking it back to Lucy really quickly, I think something that
Yeah.
intrigued me about her story so much was just being able to experience something like that in the modern world, and like how that ties into someone who's just like going about their life, living in, in real time in the world, and like how finding other people who are having fairy experiences, having those otherworldly experiences, and are totally fine with it. They somehow weave it into their normal life. I think that's so fascinating. And like Gregg was saying, I think you've introduced us to so many things, so many like resources and stories and things um that do that. It's like you're living in um you're living your life, but also interweaving these stories and these experiences into it. And I think that's so fascinating.
Yeah, super cool.
Yeah. Well, I kind of feel that it's, for me, it's the way to keep that connection with the child self.
Mhm.
So many of us lose, and enchantment is so important. I think it's really key to our well-being, and connection with nature, so important. So especially with what's happening in the world at the
Yeah.
moment.
Yeah.
Yep. 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 Reconnecting with anything that allows you to ground yourself a little and feel connected to something is probably
Yeah.
good. Probably and always has been, right? I think it's all
Mhm.
there's
Yeah,
always
definitely.
something in the world that would motivate you to want to do that.
Oh, it's wonderful to speak to you both. I've really enjoyed it. I find
Yeah.
it's just so exciting what you're working on. It's fantastic.
Yeah. Thank you,
Um,
Claire.
so how can people connect with you guys and the podcast and everything else?
I mean, really, speaking of portals, the portal really to
Mm,
everything is the main website, which is emeraldanvil.com.
mm,
And at emeraldanvil.com, you can connect to the podcast, which is on like every podcast service in the world that I know of. You can pre-order the novel, you can pre-order the game, you can learn about the NFT game if you're into that sort of stuff. But yeah, so emeraldanvil.com, I think is the starting place. We did start Lucy as a fictional character. Started her website this last episode,
yeah.
blackvelvetfairies.com. So you can go that, but that's pretty limited right now because information is not going to go onto that website until Lucy discovers it.
Hmm.
But emeraldanvil.com, short answer.
Hey,
Well,
brilliant.
yeah, thank you, Claire. We appreciate you taking time to talk
Yeah.
to us.
Thank you so much.